Hello and welcome to this podcast, which is part of a series called Inventing Embodiment. My name is Jonathan Burrows. I'm a choreographer and also a faculty member at the Centre for Dance Research at Coventry University. Last year, my colleagues at CDE met online once a week to talk, and the conversation kept coming back to the question of how we speak about embodiment. This podcast aims to capture some of the research I was fortunate to hear then. My guest this morning is Karen Wood, who is a dance artist and scholar at CDE. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Can you start by telling us a little bit about what you're researching or working on at the moment?
Yeah, sure. I am at the moment, I have a few projects happening, and one of those is looking at the working conditions of freelancers and freelance dance artists and their engagement with cultural policy. I also have a project looking at the ethics of practice, and another one that is working with dance and digital technology, in particular participative choreography. I'm also interested in tap dance as a cultural practice. So I suppose in all of these, the dancing body and the experiences are central to the exploration.
My mother was a tap dancer from a child, and right until she was in her 60s, she taught tap dancing, but she was really passionate about it. So that interests me that that's something that you're looking at. In what ways might the concept of embodiment come into or be important or not to these different researches that you're doing? Is it something you're aware of or think about or talk about with other people?
Yes, it is actually. I mean, my curiosity with embodiment, I suppose, was deepened when I did my PhD. And I investigated audiences and audiences' experience of dance on screen, and it was in particular the embodied response, and I was exploring a concept called kinesthetic empathy, and I think my interest is around embodiment and how it draws on what we know from our culture and our history. So it's this corporeal knowledge that enables us to sensorially experience the world. And this is coming from our cultural histories and perception. So it's about how we absorb information that enables us to live through our body and our consciousness when we do, and also when we watch, when we view dance as well.
Can you say a little bit more what it is, kinesthetic embodiment, empathy, sorry?
Empathy, yeah. So kinesthetic empathy is the sense of moving while you're watching movement. So how that might engage the imagination. It can be a visceral response to something. So it's a response that to something that is pleasurable to watch, but also displeasure too can engage your kinesthetic, can stimulate this kinesthetic response.
And do you, for instance, if you're speaking to people who are involved in tap dancing, do you come across people who might find the idea of embodiment a bit unknown or alien? And how do you approach that?
Yeah, well, actually, not so much. I think maybe the term embodiment, but actually what's happening in practice from the people that I have worked with is that there are these techniques that are used to embody the art form. So I'm interested in rhythm tap, which is an African American form of tap dancing, and it's also passed down through oral tradition. So there's very little written about tap dance. There's a bit more now and more happening, thankfully, but it's seen as an oral tradition passed down from the masters, if you like, of tap dance. And I've worked with somebody that used to get us to close our eyes and really embody the rhythm of what we're doing, because there's a very clear relationship with tap dance and musical structures and compositions. And to embody that rhythm, we'd start the work making sure that we really understood that in our body, we understood the rhythm. And I think that actually is very common within rhythm tap classes, that you have to take on the rhythm and understand the rhythm within your body before you can express it any other way.
Do you have any particular questions or problems with the idea of embodiment or the way that it's used in contemporary dance practice and contemporary dance scholarship?
I think that it's used a lot, and I'm not always sure of the meaning of embodiment in the different contexts that it's used. I think having conversations around what we mean about embodiment is really helpful. For example, I was involved in the Invisible Difference project, took place at Coventry at CEDAR, and it was interdisciplinary. We had lawyers working with dance experts, and the term embodiment was very differently interpreted between us, and we then had to come up with a common language and understanding of what we meant. And that conversation was really helpful, and we ended up not using the term embodiment. So it was helpful to understand where people were coming from the different disciplines. So I think those conversations are needed, or to be able to really understand what we mean by the term embodiment in those contexts. But also in teaching, I've seen it used as a criteria, for example, for assessment. And I often am interested and curious as to what that is meant by being able to assess somebody, whether they, for instance, when they embody a technique, how do we know that they're embodying a technique? I'm interested in how we're relying on sight, maybe, in the aesthetic of that technique. Has that person, though, who is carrying out the technique, what is their understanding of embodiment, and do they think that they're embodying that technique? And it's a curiosity for me of how it's used within kind of a way to measure somebody's performance.
That feels like a good place to pause. Thank you so much, Karen, for sharing those thoughts with us today.
No problem. Thank you very much.